Hello, everyone. Good day. I am Jom Salvador from Gabriela, Philippines, National Alliance of Women Grassroots Organizations in the Philippines. And I'm also working with APWLB with its Women Interrogating Trade and Corporate Hegemony program. And today I will be hosting this episode where we will unpack the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or the RCEP. The RCEP is billed as the largest free trade agreement in the world, which includes 15 countries, mostly in the Asia-Pacific region where we come from, and covers almost a third of the global economy. But behind the promise and the technocratic language of the RCEP lies an increasingly becoming apparent as a dangerous reality of the agreement, further entrenching corporate power, deepening north-south inequalities, and posing very serious threats to the environment and people's rights. And we will also critique today the looming inclusion of the Investor State Dispute Settlement Agreement mechanism, or ISDS, in RCEP's investment chapter. SDS is a colonialist mechanism that allows corporations to sue states whenever a threat to their future profits arise. And even if those laws or mechanisms that states provide are actually ways to protect the rights of workers, communities, or even the environment of these countries. And so today, we will be asking in this episode, how does RCEP, especially the ISDS, reinforce systems of extractivism, systems of inequalities that undermine people's sovereignty in the Asia-Pacific region and in the wider global South. And as feminists and people's movements, what are strategies that we can bring in so that we can challenge and expose the harms of the RCEP and other similar, perhaps, free trade agreements, and move towards collective vision of trade justice. So along with me today, as we do this podcast, I am honored to introduce seasoned activists and part of our people's movement to resist corporate capture and question and interrogate systems of inequalities, especially as they pose harms on peoples in trade agreements. I'm with us here today is Dr. Patricia Renault of Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. Hello, Dr. Pat.
Hello.
And also we have Sanila Gurung from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women and Law and Development. So hi, Sanila and Pat, and nice to meet with you today. And maybe at this point, we can have a little short description if you can further introduce yourselves and also your organization and the work that you've been doing on this issue. Dr. Pat?
Thank you for that introduction. Well, I'm the convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, which is a network of 60 community organisations. It includes women's organisations, environment, union, public health, aid and development, and human rights organisations that are concerned about the impacts on communities of trade agreements, which often prioritise corporate priorities over the needs of communities. And we have been in existence for 20 years, and we campaigned against the original corporate agenda of the RCEP, which began in 2014, I think it was. And we campaigned against many aspects, but particularly against ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, which gives corporations special legal rights to sue governments if a government changes a law or policy, and the corporation can argue that that change will affect its future profits, even if the change is in the public interest. And so in Australia, we had the example where our government passed a law restricting the advertising of tobacco, and they were sued. Our government was sued by Philip Morris Tobacco Company, an American multinational company. So that was a public health law. In the case of the RCEP, we had an international campaign. We linked up with the other, with social movements from the other countries in the RCEP, and we actually had a strong campaign, especially against ISDS in the RCEP, because we knew that if it was there, it would enable, for instance, mining companies to sue the government if they passed an environmental law, or it would enable companies to sue over Indigenous land rights if that affected their investments in mining or other investments. And so we actually had a successful campaign to exclude ISDS from the RCEP. And what is happening now is that the RCEP has been enforced for several years, and there is a move to by corporate interests, especially, and some governments to insert ISDS into the RCEP. So recently we campaigned, the first step in our campaign against this was to get a letter signed by 68 organisations from different RCEP countries in the region, and sent to our governments and publicised in each country, saying that we don't want, we want to keep excluding we want to keep ISDS out of the RCEP. I should say that both the Australian and New Zealand governments now have policies against ISDS, and so there is some prospect of success, because in order to put ISDS into the RCEP, they have to have agreement from all governments. So there are at least 2 governments who have said they will oppose it. So that's a good start.
Hello everyone, I'm Sanila. I am representing APWLD, Asia Pacific Forum on Women Law and Development. We are a leading network of feminist organization and individual activists in Asia and the Pacific. And we focus actively work towards advancing women's human rights and development justice. I'm a program officer for Women Interrogating Trade and Corporate Hegemony. This program focuses on building the capacity of women rights organizations to understand the impact of trade and investment rules on women's human rights. So in terms of ISDS as well as RCEP, we have had a lot of strong regional movements in order to challenge the ISDS, as we believe that ISDS is a legacy of colonialism, and it has been appearing in many treaties between former colonial governments and newly independent governments as means to prevent nationalization of their multinational corporation, physically property following independence. And we have also been addressing ISDS in our movements as well.
Thank you, Sanila, and thank you, Dr. Pat, for those words. And I see that we really have really a challenge when it comes to ISDS provisions being inserted into RCEP. Of course, we have movements that have through the years consistently exposed the harms of ISDS and RCEP as an agreement itself, and how ISDS provisions actually give foreign investors the power to sue governments for any policy change that might threaten profits in exchange for policy space, asserting policy space to protect and promote the rights of peoples, workers, protect indigenous land, and regulating also harmful practices of mining and other extractivist industries. And I also would like to echo some of the I think criticisms already made how ISDS actually creates a chilling effect where governments become even reluctant to regulate corporations. So out of fear of being sued in tedious and costly legal battle. And I wonder also how if any of you, Dr. Pat or Sanila, could also share insights on how you think in that way ISDS mechanisms under RCEP could potentially exacerbate women and marginalized peoples, the impacts of land grabs, resource grabs on women and marginalized communities, and if there are specific gendered implications of ISDS in terms of the peoples of the Global South or Asia Pacific. Just maybe a question or if your insights, if you can see anything of that in ISDS mechanisms.
So yes, I can go ahead. So in terms of the current global trend, as we can see that many countries are competing to secure critical minerals, in need for green energy, which is also a false solution. And under RCEP, ASEAN countries who are involved in RCEP have a lot of these resources. And then this attracts foreign direct investments. And this allows multinational corporations to have strong legal protections, such as ISDS mechanism for their investments. And so with these companies will definitely want to have this ISDS mechanism in a bigger trade deal such as RCEP. But we need to kind of understand that how it has impact communities in terms of liberalizations of trade, as well as privatizations of services, as well as avoiding tax payment, undermining policies made in public interest, push governments that limit intellectual property rights, and consumer laws, environmental protection laws, and climate policies and labor laws. And with this laws that compromised by ISDS, it leads to flexibilization and precarity of working conditions without special protection, loss of jobs, and land grabbing of indigenous communities. And this is disproportionately affected by women's human rights, as women are more vulnerable to impact of food insecurity and the degradation of land and natural resources. When public services such as healthcare, education, water are privatized, it deepens the inequality between rich and the poor classes in society. It further impacts women as they tend to fill in the gaps of unpaid care work. Domestic workers, a vast majority of whom are women, are commonly underpaid, and the work is performed under precarious working conditions. So I'll just pause here.
Thank you, Sanila. Dr. Pat, if you would like to add on to that.
Yes, well, one of the reasons why we have campaigned for our government to have a policy against ISDS, and the current government does have such a policy, is because of this chilling effect that you mentioned before, that Australia actually has a lot of mining companies, and some of them are the culprits who are investing in Southeast Asia, and that they also interfere in legislation and so on that's going on in Australia. So in terms of policies and legislation for climate change, the big international mining and energy companies, we know that they have threatened ISDS cases when the government is considering particular regulation to reduce carbon emissions. So ISDS is a real threat to effective government action against climate change. And of course, we know, as Sanila has said, that when we look at the impacts of climate change, particularly in Southeast Asian countries and in the Pacific, those communities are very vulnerable to climate change, and women are the most vulnerable. Women and children in those communities are the most vulnerable. So it's very much in the interests of women to be involved in campaigning against ISDS.
Thank you for mentioning that, Dr. Pat. And it also makes me think now that there are really serious harms in keeping this colonialist, extractivist framed mechanism of ISDS in RCEP. And there's always a reason for us, for communities to challenge ISDS and many other aspects of unequal free trade agreements. So I guess at this point, our big ask is, how do we resist? I mean, as peoples, as communities, as women and children impacted disproportionately by unequal trade agreements, by ISDS, as peoples of the global South that have been historically borne the burden of unequal trade relations. What do you think, I'd like to ask Dr. Pat and Sanila, what particular strategies of our movements and ways of challenging, but also ways of, I think, envisioning collectively in the ways that we challenge an alternative to the current system of inequality and extractivism surrounding these free trade agreements that we can put or lay now on the table of our discussion to give us also like hope and also a vision of how to resist and how to work towards our alternative vision of true development.
Well, as you rightly put it, Jones, current global political economy is currently based on inequitable and uneven power relationships between states, in which countries of the global South continue to experience an extractive relationship and has a huge impact in our human rights. So we need to strengthen our political education at all levels, strengthen cross collaboration movement, and see how we can support one another. There are already resistance and movements at the local and grassroots level, but we also need to see how we can amplify their voices at the regional and international level. And we also need to reclaim our civic space. There are many agreements that are taking place without consultations with communities as well as CSOs. So we need to make sure how we can make sure these processes are transparent and hold companies and governments accountable.
Thank you, Sanila. Dr. Pat?
Yes, I would agree with all those comments and say that most of these agreements are made in secret, and the first priority, especially for women, is to have information and transparency about the agreements themselves. Secondly, ISDS is also, all of the processes of corporations suing governments are done behind closed doors, and we need to explain to people what it is and expose it. Because as soon as you say to an ordinary person, a woman, this corporation can sue our government because it is trying to reduce carbon emissions and address the problems of climate change, they say that's ridiculous. They shouldn't have that right. They already have enormous market power, so we shouldn't be giving them additional legal powers. And the third point I think that's very important with the RCEP is international solidarity. So it's only by communicating, organising at the grassroots level, informing people, exposing these processes, and then making the connections between our movements in different countries that we can become a powerful enough force to actually have some impact on these agreements, as we did originally in keeping ISDS out of the RCEP, and hopefully in our continuing campaign to stop ISDS from being introduced into the RCEP.
Thank you, Dr. Pat. Thank you, Sanila. What really echoes to me is that when you said that the people are without power. And historically and continuing to today, the people, grassroots communities have are resisting and taking on cracks in this system of inequality, extractivism, parasitic relations between the global south, global north, corporations, and how they wrest power from the people. And I'd really like to thank our co-people in this podcast. So to perhaps wrap up today's episode, I think we need to leave a message that RCEP may be wrapped in the language of economic partnership, but really at its core, it upholds the same colonial, the same patriarchal, the same neoliberal and extractivist systems that have long exploited the global south and less developed countries. And that peoples in our communities have been resisting throughout. And with the potential inclusion of ISDS in the RCEP, it even threatens to accelerate exploitation of our resources, accelerate even the impacts of the climate crisis, and putting our communities, ecosystems, and even the sovereign policy making of our states at even greater risk than it already is. But as we said, the people, we are not without power. And our movements across the region are already exposing the system and building our version or our alternatives to the current failed system that is rooted in justice, rooted in collective self-determination, rooted in equitable use and allocation of our resources, not for the for corporations, for profit taking, but for the real benefit of the people. And so to end maybe, as the climate crisis deepens and the so-called solutions of green transition becomes now the new frontier for exploitation, there is still a thing that is so clear to us, that there can be no climate justice without trade justice. And there is no real development without people, women at the center and front of the struggle to resist extraction, to resist inequalities, and to create, a society that is centered on the power of the people, centered on collective development of peoples across a region. So thank you once again, Dr. Pat, Sanila, for this very enriching discussion of our common problems, but also our common path towards changing the system. Thank you.